How's it going, everyone? Good to see you. My name is Garrett Oyama, and I'm your host for this podcast series. It's called Converging Careers, Interprofessional Practice for Speech Therapy. And just a little background on the series, I wanted to explore ideas and insights from other fields in order to see how they might inform our practice as therapists. And I think today is really incredibly relevant and important because we'll be talking about the field of communication science, which can't get much closer to our field of communication disorders. So I really feel like it's going to be awesome. And I'm really excited to speak today with Anne Warlaumont, who is a full professor at UCLA's Department of Communication, and she directs the Emergence of Communication Lab. Her research focuses on understanding how speech vocalizations and communicative signals develop during human infancy, as well as the evolutionary roots of vocal signals. So she uses computational models and naturalistic recordings and in order to investigate early communication. And before we get started, just a few items to alert you all to. This course is 1 hour and is offered for zero point 0.1 ASHA CEUs. And just for some quick financial disclosures, we each receive an honorarium from speechtherapypd.com, but other than that, we have no disclosures. So without further ado, Anne, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you? Thank you for having me. Yeah.
No, so excited. I'm doing great. And thank you so much for joining us. It's an honor. And I always ask the guests a little bit about their origin story. So what got you into this field and interested in infant vocalizations in particular?
Yeah, sure. I got into it a little bit by accident, but a very happy accident. So I started undergrad as an engineer, thinking I wanted to do something technical, and then found that my friend down the hall in the dorm was taking a bunch of psychology classes, and I much preferred reading her textbooks to reading my ones. So I decided to switch majors and ended up majoring in psychology with a cognitive science minor. And I really, though, wanted to kind of keep a technical and engineering and computational element to approaching studying the mind. I was really interested, I guess, in just what it means to be human, to have a mind, and how we got this way. And so after undergrad, I had gotten involved in research, doing cognitive psychology stuff, and went to a lab that was where I was going to be building computational models of basic cognitive processes like categorization. But my spouse had a position in Memphis, and it was just a bit too difficult for us to do this long distance thing. So I was looking to transfer specifically to the University of Memphis. And at the University of Memphis, Kim Aller, who's in the Communication Sciences and Disorders program there, has a faculty position. And so I learned about his work studying infant vocalization. And he really comes at this topic from an evolutionary perspective, being interested in the origins, the earliest origins of human linguistic communication. And he studies infant vocalization for many reasons and for many purposes, but one of those is to really understand the early origins developmentally of language. And yeah, so I learned about his work through that because of that personal reason, and became very interested and fascinated, and ended up working with him. Yeah, and then from there, so my PhD is in CSD, but from there I went to a faculty position at UC Merced in cognitive and information sciences, and then from there to my home now in communication at UCLA. So I've been in a variety of different departments.
That's so cool. And I feel like some of the biggest breakthroughs in science occur when you have this sort of interdisciplinary background. You're able to take things from different fields and sort of find something new, which is just what we're trying to do in this podcast. So it's great. And I definitely want to ask you about Kim Aller later, but maybe just to start with communication science in general, maybe people in the audience might wonder, what is the difference? Is there a difference between, the field of communication science and communication disorders? What do you see as, what is a communication scientist to you?
That's a tough question. I mean, I think communication science is dispersed across different traditional departments. And so in terms of the communication science, I mean, you can narrow it maybe to human communication science. Certainly, when you talk about people who are studying the science of communication development, people doing research on that topic are sometimes in CSD departments, sometimes in psychology departments, sometimes in linguistics, in my case, in communication, which I think is pretty rare, sometimes even in anthropology, computer science, electrical engineering. So, yeah, there's just so many different fields that touch this topic. And
Yeah, what that sort of suggests to me is like how fundamental and foundational communication really is, and how it touches a lot of aspects of science and just what it takes to understand communication. It's not so simple. You can't just put it in one box,
yeah,
which is really exciting in a lot of ways. And maybe in talking more about following up on your research with Kim Aller, I know he studies infant vocalizations, which this could be different for other SLPs out there. I don't know, but at least in my program, there wasn't a big emphasis on early infant vocalizations. I mean, we learned a little bit about, okay, at 6 months, you'll see canonical babbling and it looks like this. And, after that, there wasn't much emphasis placed on that. It was more on, once you get kids talking, how do they articulate certain sounds, things like that. But you mentioned this study of infant vocalizations is really rich. So I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts? Why is it so important that we understand infant vocalizations?
oh yeah, I was really surprised when you said that about not having as much coverage maybe of this topic, because it is the okay, so infant vocalizations, many of you already know or have covered in your coursework, but I guess the period of infant vocalization that I'm most interested in is the entire first year of life, basically. So from birth through, yeah, until the first birthday, tracking this period of time leading up to when infants start producing recognizable words. Actually, some of the behaviors that we see or focus on during this time period, so mainly the babbling or not yet meaningful, but speech-related pre-speech sounds, do continue throughout at least the second year of life in pretty high quantities, which is another thing that we could talk about. But so there's this whole year between birth and first words, which is a lot of time. And there's lots of vocal activity going on, and it's all laying the foundations for speech. And that includes different aspects of the speech capacity. So that includes developing the motor control to be able to use articulators and the larynx in the ways that are needed to produce speech sounds of increasing complexity, but also the pragmatic foundations. So learning how to take turns with another person, learning first, well, maybe not, this may not be learned, but producing sounds that are decoupled from specific emotional or other contexts. So cries are always coupled to the you're needing something, and negative emotional context on the infant side, and laughs as well are always coupled with, or always tied to a more positive interpersonal context, whereas the pre-speech sounds, everything else that we study seems to be functionally flexible. So that's another foundation for speech. And so like this sounds that infants produce during the first year change a lot over the course of that period of time. And those changes track sort of building the foundational skills for speech. So I think that's really important for understanding what speech is and how to get it.
Yeah, I think this is something that's totally sort of missed in a lot of the speech therapy programs that are out there, is this sort of developmental trajectory that you're mentioning in the first year, before you have meaningful speech. There's a lot going on, and huge developmental changes that can reflect. And I've heard, according to some research at least, that for example, late onset of canonical babbling predicts speech delay and reduced vocabulary size, things like that. So it really is important to be aware and thinking at this period, how can you support your child's speech development through this you mentioning social interaction with the parent being part of this process as well. I guess, yeah, this is maybe a big question, but in thinking about sort of the nature nurture aspect of infants starting to vocalize, how much of a role, maybe this is just like there's no real clear answer to this, but how much of a role do you think the environment plays in, I guess, bringing out these speech sounds?
I'm really not sure. I think it's been a complicated question to answer. So with pre-linguistic vocal development, some of that process seems to proceed without the need for a lot of interaction with another person, or even the need for hearing, actually.
Mm,
So deaf infants, Kim Muller was one of the people who discovered this, but deaf infants go through some of these stages of babbling. For instance, they produce canonical babbling a bit later than a hearing infant, and with different rate proportions of different types of consonants within that canonical babbling. So canonical babbling being babbling that has kind of speech-like consonant vowel transitions within it. And so the fact that an infant who doesn't have, who's severe or profoundly deaf can still go through some of these stages and produces a lot of vocalization suggests that there's a nature component, right? A strong
right.
nature component. Another reason to think that is a strong, or that maybe, yeah, some of this process may be robust to different environmental and social circumstances, is that we haven't seen big socioeconomic status influences on the onset of canonical babbling. So yeah, so that milestone in particular, might be one that is in large part driven by like maturational things or exploratory processes that the infant maybe goes through a little bit more independently, or can go through independently, and that might be able to be influenced not only by hearing but also tactile or sort of other sensory things that happen when you make vocalizations.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, yeah, it seem like so one of the things that about vocalization in the first year that does seem more influenced by SES is just overall how much you're vocalizing. And we know that the amount of vocalization that a child produces provides like the raw material for them to engage in conversational vocalization activities.
Yeah.
So yeah. And
Mm,
then yeah. So I mean, and then it's very hard to disentangle these things because, well, yeah. Anyways, there's also other work, experimental work, Mike Goldstein's work in particular, that I think has been really informative because it's experimental. That's really helpful. That has suggested, at least in the short term, that there's influences of responding to an infant contingently. So when an infant vocalizes and then there's an adult sort of immediately follows that with a sound that contains some kind of speech sounds, or with some other kind of positive engagement with the child, that seems to change the types of sounds that infants produce in subsequent sessions. Yeah,
yeah.
so yeah, and we're not really sure. But
Got it. Yeah. Yeah. As all these things, everything's more complicated
yeah.
than it looks. I feel like a lot of people, it's just like, oh yeah, kids talk. It's like this magic sort of, it just grows like teeth or hair or something like that. But there's so much going on. This complex engagement. Part of it, like you're saying, is maybe something like maturational processes, like you're mentioning. There's just a bit of exploratory play that the child is trying to do, and then there's also the contingent responses that you're talking about. And that was one thing I wanted to ask about, because I thought it was just so cool, some of the research that you have been involved with, and also in the particular methodology that you use, which is Lena, right? So I'm using these day-long recorders. For people who haven't heard about it, infants will wear a little recorder all day so that you can hear these vocalization periods over longer time scales. And looking at that research has allowed scientists to see a little bit more, with a little bit more granularity, what's going on. And you've done some amazing work on that. And maybe one thing that you have a paper on is infant vocalizations being a type of foraging. And I was wondering if you can explain this a little bit more, as I thought this was so cool.
Oh yeah, sure. Happy to. Yeah, this is my kind of current way that I view the vocal behavior that we see in infancy. It's just the kind of particular theoretical lens that I've been putting on it that I think helps with formulating research questions, interpreting findings, and things like that. So the idea is that vocalization is a behavior that infants do that allows them to sort of probe their own vocal abilities as well as social consequences. So yeah, so we can think about vocalization as an exploratory process, but where sometimes when an infant produces a vocalization, things happen, and those things can be viewed as rewards that then once one is received sort of shapes the subsequent exploratory behavior of the child, maybe both in the short term and the long term. I mean, one advantage of looking of considering vocalization to be a foraging process is that then allows us to import analytical approaches from other scientific fields that study foraging. So there are lots of biologists who study spatial foraging behavior. So when animals move around in their environments searching for food or for mates, as well as cognitive foraging. So there are cognitive scientists that study how, for example, people search their own memory to retrieve items. And so there actually are parallels between those two domains. And if we then sort of bring vocalization as another domain in which individuals forage, it allows us to take some of those tools that are used in those other fields and apply them to infant vocalization and maybe get some new insights.
That's so cool. Yeah, and it also sort of brings up this point of something that I've been harping on for a long time is that there is, the parent plays a pretty critical role once, maybe past this stage, once they start using their voice and get to this canonical babbling stage, that, the resources they're foraging for are built into the interaction with the parent, right? Like you were mentioning that certain vocalizations will, I'm just thinking what might happen, elicit a surprise reaction or a happy response or, an angry response from the parent. And each of these things is sort of like a feedback for shaping these vocalizations, if I'm understanding correctly. But that sort of really emphasizes the point that is also seems to be borne out in longitudinal data with Lena, that the social feedback loop with the caregiver and the turns the conversational turn taking seems to be one of the biggest factors in, later language development.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's very reasonable to think that because we know about well, yeah, there are lots of wonderful studies documenting the relationship between experiences of turn taking and how often a child experiences that in various language and other school outcomes and so on. So I actually would say that I think this applies from even much earlier than canonical babbling onset. I think this applies from even like the first days and weeks after birth. And there's a few reasons to think that. So one is just because we have evidence from other studies of infant behavior that infants are sensitive to contingencies from very, very young ages. And there's no reason to think that that wouldn't also apply in the vocal domain. It's just another motor domain. Or if you do something and there's a consequence, which there's always a consequence for vocalization because the infant hears something when they, get their vocal tract into a particular position. So they get that already, that non-social consequence. But, if they also have if there are also reliable social consequences of vocalizing, then I think that just can be added in. And I don't see any reason why that wouldn't apply really, really early. And in fact, I have 3 children. And because I studied this already when I had them, I always was really attentive to their vocalization early on. And so I have a strong sense. Yeah. I mean, so this is not, but I mean, I think it seems to me that that's probably at play really early.
Yeah, so cool. I always think about Ted Broy's TED Talk, Birth of a Word, where he goes from, you hear the speech form go from like this really primitive, like gaga something to water. And you hear like, number one, like just the length of time that it stays in this form and even gets worse in some area, in some times, and then it gets better. It's kind of like watching someone learn how to throw a ball. Like when they're really young, they're kind of trying all over the place, and then they finally get the correct form, and that gets, sort of, what's the word, reinforced by, parents saying awesome job, or like, seeing yourself hit the target. And so, yeah, I feel like some parents that, and working in early intervention as a speech therapist, you have parents that get worried, like, oh, they're babbling for a while, they're saying these speech forms well, and then suddenly they're not, and is something wrong? Is something happening? Do you feel like this is, based on your research, is this something that's like natural, that's like part of the developmental process?
Yeah, definitely. And then I think like from this foraging perspective that it really makes sense that kind of thing would happen. And first of all, yes, I love that TED Talk by Deb Roy, because I think it really highlights the just utter beauty of this process. And it's so easy from his talk to appreciate that. But yes, so if we think about, if it's true that vocalization is kind of like this foraging process where, okay, I have to kind of take a step back, but
Sure.
in foraging behavior, there's an element of randomness in most of our understanding of these kind of processes. So an individual decides that they're going to make a move, but the distance that they travel and the time it takes to get there is often sort of modeled as being random. But how far they go can also be influenced by whether they just received some kind of resource. So if they've discovered that they're in a patch where they're getting food or finding items in their memory, or in our case, they're in a patch of vocalization that's intrinsically interesting or is generating responses from other people, that might cause an individual to stay in the patch for a while. But when they're not, or just sometimes because random shifts happen in the system, they might be randomly searching different positions in space or region topics in their memory, or in our case with vocal foraging, different configurations of the vocal tract, including many which don't generate any sound at all, or some which generate different types of sounds. And so, yeah, just in these kinds of processes, it tends to be the case that we see clumpy behavior result from this combination of different processes. And so sometimes individual will produce a sequence of lots of stuff of a particular type, and then they might have long gaps before they produce a behavior again, and it might be of a different type, or there might be intermediate gaps and more intermediate shifts in type. And that's just a very natural natural part of all of these sort of foraging type behaviors. And so from that perspective, it seems it's not surprising that infants would have times of their day or days of the week when not always the same day, but days when they're maybe quieter or maybe they're vocal, but they're focusing on a particular kind of vocalization a bit more. And then other days, hours, minutes where they're more vocal, or producing different kinds of vocalizations. And that's just a normal part of the process. And yeah, I think that's really helpful for anyone who's contacting a baby to understand and appreciate.
Yeah. Yeah. That must be so cool to have kids and like really be able to study this firsthand all the time. You mentioned something one time to me that I thought, it really kind of questioned or it made me think a lot about what is really going on in the interaction between parent and infant. And so you mentioned once that vocal play sometimes is, perhaps even undermined by, or distraction at least, to, positive reinforcement from parents. And I suppose I often emphasize how important it is to be in interaction with your child, especially in today's world. I won't get on my soapbox, but I feel that there's, digital, a role that digital devices have played in at least reducing the amount of time spent in really rich interactions with children. But yeah, I was wondering what has led you to think that, maybe positive reinforcement might be a distraction to vocal play, or might in some cases get in the way or be a barrier to this process.
Yeah. Oh, you remember that conversation too. Yeah, okay. So there's lots and lots of studies that suggest that there's a relationship between infant experiencing frequent contingent responses and all kinds of speech related outcomes, right? At varying levels of or degrees of delay. So there seems to be a strong association between getting a lot of contingent vocal responding and being somebody who vocalizes a lot, someone who maybe achieves speech milestones sooner, et cetera. But in my research, one thing I've been interested in for a long time is, can we detect those effects of that, of a contingent response in as they occur in real everyday situations. And in doing that research, it's become a little bit of an obsession that it's just really, really hard to control for all the things you need to control for, to identify that there is, what effect there is immediate, and what immediate effect there is of a contingent response. So you have to kind of control, if you really want to know if this particular response is, well, I guess if you want to detect effective immediate response on subsequent infant behaviors, so show, for example, that receiving a response leads to an immediate increase in an infant's likelihood of vocalization, or an immediate change so that they're producing the same kind of vocalization as they just got a response for. I feel like in my own work, I haven't fully controlled for all of the things methodologically that are important to control for. So I've been coming up with new methods to control for all those things that you would need. So to elaborate, one source of concern is that when infants vocalize, now we know from this various other studies that infants tend to produce vocalizations in these clumps. And if it's true that adults have a tendency to put their responses in those clumps, it might look like a response is leading the infant to vocalize again soon, but it might actually not be the case. It might just be that the infant was already in this clump of high density vocalization. And what we're really tracking is more just the adult's tendency to insert their vocalizations during that time. And that, may have other benefits, but it just might not be that those vocalizations from the adults are actually causing the immediate next infant vocalization. So obsessing over this and trying to come up with methods to get around that concern has made me just very attentive to which research studies have controlled for these kinds of things and which haven't, which most haven't, including my own. But also, as I've been raising my own children, I have a 10-month-old now. So as I've been doing this work in the last 10 months, for example, I've been hanging out with him and thinking about what's happening. Do I really feel like my vocalization here helped? And just anecdotally, there have been lots of times when I feel like my jumping in to respond has maybe shifted him into a little different state where he might have been vocalizing. And then, so I'm not sure. I think that in any particular instance of vocalization, any particular type of response might sometimes have that reinforcing facilitative effect. I mean, I think even with controls we're putting in, we're seeing that finding it emerging still. But at the same time, in some instances, I think it just can take an infant maybe out of a play period that they were experiencing their own. Yeah, there's a lot of complexity.
So basically, these patterns of these clumped patterns exist already. So, previous research that might have suggested that, because we saw this clump here connected to this parent vocalization, that was causing this clump to happen. But in fact, those clumps exist regardless of parent involvement.
Right. So I think that kind of complicates our ability to, understand what those mean. And so then as a parent or other person who's interacting with an infant, I think we naturally, when we're really fully paying attention, and this is where one way in which I think electronic device usage can be really damaging is not just in the distractions for the child, but in the distractions it creates for caregivers. Because I think it interferes with our sort of just being attuned to the particular interaction we're in and the person we're hanging out with. But yeah, I think naturally as caregivers, we do some sort of, it's like a dance or it's a dyadic thing where we're trying to help our children. So sometimes we sense that this is a good time to respond and be encouraging and provide some stimulation. And other times are times to sort of sit back and let them do the talking, even though it's not meaningful speech yet, but yeah.
It sort of reminds me of, and I think we mentioned this too, but there's other research on how a child who is sort of innately drawn to doing something like, let's say, drawing or music, who is then positively reinforced through candy or something like that, like they get a reward every time they do this thing that was, at once intrinsically motivating, shifts to being an extrinsically motivated behavior. So they stop doing that thing that they at first love to do because they associated it with this external reward. I don't know if that's related, but it just sort of reminded me of that a little bit. And it's also hopeful that, because it's clear that there is it is very important to interact at, the child, but it sort of opens the door for the future of like understanding, number one, how what specific things lead to other specific things, and then how to most effectively use this interaction in a way that's most productive for language development. So that seems like an area that is ripe for new discovery, and discoveries that will hopefully be really helpful to therapists and families that are working with kids who are at risk for communication disorders.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that connection you're making to other fields in which the effects of reinforcement and intrinsic motivation, think that's very potentially applicable to this domain too, and hasn't really been something that I've seen discussed. So that'd be a really great topic to study, I think, for someone to study.
Yeah. Yeah, it is so interesting. And, this is a little bit of a departure, but in talking, I did a webinar recently with some of the group. Even here, I think some of the participants were there, but we talked a little bit about AI, and this is kind of a big topic now. A lot of times it's, how can ChatGPT help me to lesson plan or something like that? But I know that you have used AI in sort of a different way. So both like AI and computational modeling are sort of like methodologies for understanding big data, and may have implications for other things too, like screening in the future. But I'm wondering if you could maybe touch on that a little bit, and how you've used AI in sort of this other way to analyze data.
Yeah, for data analysis, for sure. I think those of us who are using day long, sometimes we'll call them long form as well, audio recordings, are really interested in any way that we can actually get our entire day's worth of audio efficiently tagged with it according to when the events that we're interested in are happening, and maybe details of the nature of those events. So the Lena system comes with algorithms for identifying at what points during the recording it thinks different sound sources are present, and those sound sources include the child who's wearing the recorder, other children, female adults, male adult, electronic sounds, and then noise and overlap category are there too. So the system that I use already has these, and then we make heavy use of that as a first pass. And lots of our studies really depend on whether that system is accurate enough for what we're using it for. So, but then that algorithm actually hasn't undergone major updates since the late 2000s, and a lot has changed with the power of algorithms and models since then. So various researchers are working on applying maybe like more modern or alternative, at least, speech and audio recognition systems to these day-long data. It turns out so that we could maybe get more accurate labelings or more detailed labelings. So maybe not just labeling when particular types of individuals are vocalizing, but if they're speaking, what words they're speaking, if they're a child, or is this a canonical babble or cry? Lena system already does the cry thing, but maybe we can get more accurate. So that's one purpose. It's challenging because it turns out Alex Christia, who's a researcher in Paris, had co-organized a several weeks long workshop at Johns Hopkins, which took place several years ago. Anyways, as a result of part of her work with that group, so the workshop was to apply learning-based tools to different real-world data sets. And one thing that they discovered is that these kinds of child-worn audio recorder data are probably the hardest data to automatically classify. They're just child vocalizations are not as clean and crisp and as speech-like as adult speech. And the environment in which these recordings are taking place is very just filled with all kinds of natural other sounds that complicate it. So applying existing algorithms to these data is really important because we want to be able to process a 10-hour or 16-hour long recording in its entirety quickly. But it's not actually, these algorithms don't necessarily work right out of the box when you throw them at these kind of data at this point in time. So a lot of the work is like, yeah, trying to, or the interface between AI and this type of work is just, yeah, using it to try to get the labels that we want on these audio recordings and trying to improve, like fine tune out existing algorithms with the kind of data that we're using to get them to work at a higher level of accuracy. There's also a lot of work that we have to do to assess that level of accuracy. And then that means using human listeners to basically label the data in the way that we want so that we can get it to, yeah. The other application of machine learning that more of artificial intelligence or computational modeling in my work is trying to build a system, a model that can learn to control a simulated vocal tract in the way that, well, in a way that has some similarity to what we think is happening with infants. And that's sort of a very different application of machine learning for this problem.
Yeah, yeah. It's so cool to hear about how this technology is being used in just different ways than we're typically taught. And it also seems to, like you were mentioning, how it is trying to decipher, what is, a cry versus a speech sound or something like that. And it sort of suggests at least that our brains are doing something like incredibly refined and complex, and that the actual sonic signals that we hear, like there's not as much, or at least it takes a ton of input in order to sort of differentiate between some of these things. And one of those things is music and speech. And I know that's another like interest. And at this sort of basic level, and a lot of people, like, they're like, okay, yeah, obviously music is whatever, it's Bach, and then like speech is someone giving a talk or something like that. But like in reality, the line between these things is pretty vague. You have I don't know, spoken word that could sort of be sung like infant directed speech is, kind of floats between that boundary. And so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on sort of how music and speech are either similar or different, how infants might use music to help them talk or.
Yeah, no, I think, yeah, so looking at these everyday audio recordings, what children are experiencing in their day-to-day environment from morning till evening gives a opportunity to really just see for a particular child what kinds of audio signals are they experiencing, and that includes so many different things. So it includes speech. Some of the speech is directed to them, some of it's not. Some of the speech directed to them is like telling them to stop doing something. Others of it is like teaching them about their world. Others of it is trying to kind of soothe them to sleep. It's just everything that you can imagine an infant would experience, and that gets picked up. And then some of what they experience is musical, and that's all different kinds of musical possibilities. So in the voice side, there's actual, in singing a specific song to a child, ABCs or Twinkle Twinkle. And sometimes the adults are singing to themselves, like for their own entertainment and just sometimes they're singing along to something that's recorded, and that might be child directed or child oriented stuff, or it might be something that the adult is listening to on their own, or there's also, anyway, so staying with the voice stuff, there's also this, speech that's not particularly musical. And then there's sort of stuff in between, cases where like adult says the same thing in a sing-songy way, or maybe more rhythmic than would normally, or just does their own vocal play. Yeah, so there's lots of interesting things that adults would not necessarily do in a public setting that they would do in the presence of their baby, that really is sometimes ambiguously musical or not. And then there's also other kinds of musical sound sources, so recordings or even live instrumental sounds that infants experience. Caitlin Fauci's lab, Jennifer Mendoza has been a main collaborator of hers at the University of Oregon, has done really amazing work with day-long audio recordings, having annotators, undergraduate research assistants for the most part, listening to an entire day's worth of audio and
Wow.
tagging every time that the infant experienced something musical, and actually also identifying the tune of that they're hearing. And yeah, they can show you how those sounds are distributed. It turns out that kind of like aligned with this foraging and clumpiness pattern on the vocalization side, on the inputs that infants are receiving, they will tend to hear one tune making up the majority of their musical input, but lots of other tunes. And Caitlin has some really nice ideas about how that might maybe benefit the infants learning about music. And if this kind of way that sounds are distributed might help infants, it might also help machines. So it's definitely interplay between using AI to do our research, but also using our research to maybe inform AI if certain kinds of distributions of input or interactive experiences help children to learn from these signals. Maybe that would also help artificial learners too. So anyway, that's lots of thoughts
Right.
on that topic. I
Yeah.
can talk about
Yeah.
it in more
Oh, there's
detail.
so much. I want to grab like all these different parts of it, and I'm trying to figure out which one. But yeah, I mean, I guess, on your last point, how it might help the algorithms, it also helps our understanding of how we develop. It's an interplay because, I think at some point in the past, programmers and linguists thought that you could model speech with, very strict algorithms. Like you have these sets of rules that would, sort of like a Chomsky grammar sort of thing, where you have these sets of rules that would then help you generate any, amount of speech. But now with these LLMs, it's sort of implying something different, that, it really takes a lot of huge amounts of human input, and then you can get to, complicated things like verb movement and all this stuff just through a bunch of input, which is
Yeah.
kind of cool. So you're not starting with the rules; you're sort of like inferring them. And yeah, I guess, and there's so much, and maybe this is too much of an ask in 3 minutes, but I know that you also are interested in, that sort of the evolutionary perspective on language development, and I'm wondering if you have any quick thoughts on evolutionary roots of vocal signals. It might be something for a different time, but
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I do think that it's not always the case that development recapitulates evolution. It's not always the case, but it often is. And, certainly in order to evolve human speech, what evolved is probably these developmental trajectories, or what evolved. So I think understanding the very earliest stages of human communication development, the kinds of things that we see in their first year of life, it definitely informs our understanding of what must have happened or may have happened, at least in our ancestors. And there are questions that can be asked when you or be answered, I guess, by asked and answered by looking at infant behavior that can inform conversations that we're having. So a postdoc I'm currently working with, Megan Brocart-Reed, but who was also a former Kim Aller student for her dissertation, she was very interested in seeing if there would, well, in pursuing the question about the gestural versus vocal origins of human communication and human language. And she came to the realization that actually gesture and vocalization had not been compared directly in a way that, well, with coding of the two channels of behavior, or two modalities that would really make them comparable in the pre-linguistic period. And so she developed a scheme for coding gesture that better resembled the scheme, or was more analogous to the scheme that we use for coding vocalizations. And that sort of allowed her to compare these two modalities quantitatively more direct. And she found that infants do a lot more vocalizing than gesturing. And, but they gesture in ways that seem to be complementary. So research on infant vocalization and infant gesture so this can all be related to other discussions that have been had in the literature about whether language derives from gesture or derives from vocalization or from both. And yeah, so that's just one little bit. Yeah.
fascinating. Yeah, I would definitely want to hear. I got to ask you later about the name of that researcher, the postdoc.
Megan Kirkby.
Megan Bernhardt. Okay, cool. I guess last quick question before we move on to some questions that anyone might have. But what are some other? Maybe this is one of them. But what are some unanswered questions about vocal development, language development more broadly that you'd like to see, that you'd most like to see answered in the next 10 years or so?
Oh, great. Lots. One thing that's been on my mind has been what's the relationship between the non-speech signals like cry and laugh and speech. Some researchers have proposed that these are really distinct channels, but in our coding, all the hand coding we've done to train and evaluate algorithms, for instance, those it's really hard to draw to figure. It seems like there's a continuum between cry or fussing or whimpering kind of behavior and early sounds that we know to be speech related. And so understanding better what the origin, what are, yeah, how connected those two types of vocalization are is something that I would like to see more more work on. Oh, there's so many questions. Yeah. Uh, too hard to answer that
Got
question.
it. Yeah.
Too hard to pick one.
I think
But
that's
yeah.
fantastic.
Mhm.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. That was really cool. I just want to open it up for a few minutes for some, if anyone has any questions in the audience, and feel free to write in the Q&A. There's a Q&A box or the chat box. I can see both of them. So yeah, feel free to ask any questions that you might have. And while we're waiting, this is a totally unrelated question, but I've just been asking all of my guests for some reason or another, is if you had to take 5 albums onto a desert island, what albums would you take with you?
Oh, I don't know
I'm
if I
taking my own data right now because I've had all these guests on and I've asked them all.
oh, I'm not sure if I would choose. We'll have time to say five, but Joni Mitchell's Blue has been a favorite for a long time. Yeah, that one for sure.
I just saw an amazing video of Joni Mitchell recently, and she was playing in some crazy guitar tuning that I just couldn't figure out. I thought it was maybe just drop D, but yeah, the chords were so beautiful.
Oh yeah, it's just amazing. Yeah.
Well, very cool. Yeah, I guess when you've started researching all of this stuff, did you expect to be here asking these questions? Did you start out with some idea, or did you kind of just let your sort of curiosities guide you as they popped up?
A little bit of both for sure. Yeah, the thing I really wanted to do when I started my PhD was to work on building computer models that could learn to babble. I just thought if we could do that, we would understand it would show that we have some understanding of the mechanisms of this process, which is so hidden, but so important for understanding the basic building blocks of speech and language. And yeah, so some of my research has definitely followed that path, less so in recent years because I think that's like the least marketable and the highest risk in the project, and also requires a fair amount of technical skill, which not every student has or has interest in developing. So yeah, so I would like to be working more on that. I guess I should probably say that would probably be more my true, dream for the next 5 or 10 years to see developments in that area. But then yeah, other like the day-long audio recording, that wasn't a thing until around 2008 when the Linus system really came onto the market and started being used. And that was a couple of years into my program. And I got an early start because Kim Muller, right, who I worked with, was on their scientific advisory board. And so he kind of connected me. And when I learned about that system, I was like, oh, I don't even know what I'm going to use it for, but that's what I want to do. I just look so exciting. So some of the questions have been things that have
From,
emerged.
that's so cool. From what I understand, Kim Aller was the person who came up with, who sort of started the whole idea of a developmental trajectory for babbling and like develop the stages. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah. The way he tells the story, it was a convergent thing. So there was a community of child phonologists or people who, an emerging community of child phonologists that there had been this misunderstanding that in the field that babbling was like random and unrelated to language. And so that,
I
but
see.
sometime in the 70s, he and other individuals realized that maybe that wasn't true. And so he came up with this scheme for characterizing infant vocalizations that was based on doing lots of listening to infants producing sounds at different ages, and we got a couple of other researchers at the same time.
That's amazing that we,
Yeah.
it's amazing we've only known since the 70s that like babbling is related to language. So we have a few questions coming in. So KK, what's up KK, asked if there's an article you could recommend to investigate this topic further. And she mentioned one that's characterizing the structure of infants' everyday musical input by Jennifer Mendoza. Is there anything that you'd recommend?
Yeah, that one is a great article. I think it's in Developmental Science, characterizing the structure of infants' everyday musical input. Yeah, that would be the main one that would be the study I was trying to summarize a bit. So if you're
Cool.
interested in the topic, definitely reading that one. Fauci and Mendoza have, I think, another paper since then, which looks at the intervals between musical experiences. And then with Caitlin Fauci and Kunmi Sobowale, who's here at UCLA in the medical school, we have an article in a journal called Current Directions in Psychological Science, which talks about the kinds of ways that events are distributed in day-long recordings. We talk a little bit about that work in that article.
I think this is how you spell Fauci. Is that correct?
Oh. Yep, that's right.
Okay. I was spelling it like Fauci in my Google search. That's not correct. Great, thank you. And then Karen asks one more question. How long has Anne been working on her different interests in infant vocalizations?
Oh, thank you. Let's see. Probably since 2007, maybe. So how many years is that?
2007. Yeah. Okay, so 13, 17 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Anne, thank you so much. You're an inspiration, and it's so valuable to, talk to you about this field and all your research. Where can people find you?
Oh, yeah.
Get in touch, or if you don't mind.
Yeah, my website's a little bit out of date just with all the baby and everything. I'm like, I need to make some updates, but yeah, I have a website. It's annewarlaumont.org, and that's supposed to be my website, but it's definitely needs to be updated with the current members. But yeah, you can find some of our more description there.
And added the website research section in there. And any last remarks or conclusions you'd like to leave us with?
I guess I didn't talk about this in our interview, but I'm trying to always, whenever possible, remember to plug a resource called Bank, which is a component of TalkBank, which is just an amazing set of different databases of conversation, language, and that kind of data. So HomeBank is a particular sort of resource that we have. Yeah. This is a collection this is where you can find examples of day-long audio recordings. Anybody can become a member. There's a little bit of a process, but somebody else has a ton of them. Yeah, so congratulations. So yeah, that HomeBank has a collection of these day-long audio recordings, which anybody can access. So if you're interested in what they sound like or in doing any research projects of your own or using them for instructional purposes, we hope that people will use it. Totally free.
Yeah. KK is asking. I put it. KK, I added it right here. I'll put it in again. Check out that link, and find the resources there. Yeah. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you again at another speech therapy PD.com lab course.
Thank you,
Thank you
Garrett.
so much.
Mm.